morning. This is Pastor Tim coming to you from Central Texas, from the United Methodist Churches at Bend and Lomita, called small country churches that are doing a big ministry. We want to invite you anytime you want to come in with podcast. We live cast on Sunday morning at 9 at Bend, Bend, Texas UMC, Facebook. Have a website. We invite you to stop in on it sometime. We are doing some discussing of how the Bible is, the parts that make up the Bible. I felt like that if someone was beginning to study the Bible for the first time, it could be very confusing and overwhelming. And so we ought to break it down into small parts so that people could begin to delve in and find out what they have in their hand when they begin reading, to kind of put things into place, and a kind of framework from which to study the Bible. Today we're going to do the wisdom literature. There's a lot of wisdom literature in the Bible that's just advice, it's stories, it's reflections on life. It's not just the events of the scriptures, but people try to put that wisdom into place for other folks to read and take for the good advice for living. The wisdom literature as official literature started about 3,000 years before the time of Christ in Egypt and Mesopotamia, but there's a lot of it in the Bible. There's Proverbs, for one, that has a lot of pithy sayings, a lot of little things that give you advice. In it, wisdom is a woman, but so is folly. So it's the whole literature, wisdom literature, tends to talk about it from the female perspective. So it gives advice on how to live and how to be a good son, how to be a good daughter, how to be a good person. So you can read those a little at a time and reflect on whether that's true in our day or time or not. Another one is Job. Job is it's a protest book of sorts. Everything happens to Job. He's a prosperous man, and everything goes wrong. His animals die, his servants die, his children die. Everything within a matter of moments. It's a more physical pain and grief than any one person can endure. And his wife is so helpful by saying, "Why don't you curse God and die?" But he persists, and he wants to argue with God. After his friends show up and begin to say, "Well, it's probably he did something and it's his fault." The predominant wisdom of the time was that if you do something good will happen to you. If you do something bad will happen to you. And so anything that happens to you is your own fault. And so they kept trying to push Job to say, there's something you did that you may not remember, that you didn't even notice you did, that made God angry. And so that's why all this is happening. And finally, God shows up after 30 chapters and says to the friends, "Who do you think you are? You don't know anything." And he turns to Job and says, "Well, you don't know how the world's put together. You weren't there when I made the seas and the mountains. I'm God and you're not." And that's basically to say that you don't have a big enough mind to understand the planets, the universe, the nature of the planets and the universe and time. Only God has, so we can't never have God's perspective. So we'll never know what logic there is to many of the events in our lives, and to put our logic on God and say, surely God must think the same as we do. Job protests against that. And so that's one of the wisdom books. Another one's the Song of Solomon, which is kind of ironic because it's really a love poem. And if you read it just as a love poem, it's pretty erotic. But it's also read as a love story between the Hebrew people and God. Even though God is not mentioned, it became the foundation of one of the festivals in the Jewish faith. Ecclesiastes is another one, which translates the preacher. Is very negative. All is vanity. There's nothing that really matters. Everything that humans do is like grass that lives in its time and dies and amounts to nothing. It sounds very, very negative, but he also commands faith in God. So that's it's very interesting to express that kind of negativity. Of course, the biggest source of literature is Psalms. That's the church's songbook. It has a lot of wisdom, and it is arguing with God. It has describing God's faithfulness and also challenging God's justice. You can read through the Psalms and find moods for just about anything. They're for all occasions, for installing a king or for doing a funeral, for a pilgrimage or worship. The psalmist doesn't stand back from any topic to challenge God or to declare faithfulness in God. The end, though, it describes God's faithfulness to the people and how God gives grace, even undeserved grace, to those who are worshiping together. So there is a lot of wisdom in the Bible. And sometimes we can look through that and find those places, not just of events, but of people sharing what they've learned through the ages. So that's the wisdom literature in the Old Testament. I'll see you next time.